Hi, everyone. My name is Paityn Bower, and I'm the outreach biologist for the International Crane Foundation Gulf Coast programs. And today I'm going to be talking to you about the whooping crane. At the International Crane Foundation, we work worldwide to conserve cranes and ecosystems watersheds on flyways on which they depend. We work in over 50 countries across 5 continents to provide knowledge, leadership, and inspiration to engage people in resolving threats to cranes and their diverse landscapes. We have 15 species of cranes found worldwide. They are all beautiful and unique in their own ways. So unfortunately, 10 of our 15 species of crane are listed as vulnerable or endangered, including our whooping crane. The whooping crane, standing at 5 feet tall, makes them the tallest flying bird in North America. They're also the rarest of the 15 crane species. They show seasonal weight variation with a maximum weight in December and January and a minimum weight in July and August. Their lifespan ranges from 22 to 24 years in the wild and 35 to 40 years on average in captivity. We do have a couple of cranes that have lived into their 60s and 70s, so it can be quite a bit higher than that 35 to 40 years on average. Their wingspan ranges between 7 and 8 feet, and of course they are listed as endangered, but they are currently increasing. They're known for their snowy white plumage, long dark legs used for wading in the water and traversing the salt marsh. And they are easily distinguished by their bright red crown and their dark eye mask. They typically have yellow eyes and a brown or olive colored beak. A little bit about the anatomy of the crown itself. It can often be confused for feathers, but these are actually blood-filled sacs found on the top of their heads. When they are showing a territorial response, it can grow larger and redder as those sacs are filling with more blood as a response or a warning. And one really cool thing about them, they get their name from their loud call, that whoop that they're so famous for. And this is due to their 4-foot-long trachea. So their call can travel up to 2 miles. And it's looped around kind of like a trombone. In comparison to a human trachea, which is only about 4 inches, their 4-foot-long trachea is fairly large and looping. On the Gulf Coast, we work with 2 populations of whooping cranes. We work with the Aransas wood buffalo population, which is the last wild self-sustaining population of whooping cranes that migrates between down on the Texas coast all the way up to Wood Buffalo National Park in the Northern Territories of Canada. And we also work with the Louisiana non-migratory population. As you can infer from the name, they are non-migratory. They're non-self-sustaining. And there are other whooping crane populations that we don't personally work with, but other ICF employees do, including the Eastern migratory population that migrates between Wisconsin and Florida. These are the famous ones that were taught to migrate with ultralight aircraft from Wisconsin when they were reintroduced down to Florida. And then the Florida non-migratory population, these were introduced in 1993 when 33 birds were introduced to the area. They never learned to migrate. I think we have about 2 left within this population hanging out in Florida. And then we also had Gray's Lake population, which was a bit of an experimental population where sandhills were given whooping crane eggs, hoping that they would imprint on whooping cranes. Unfortunately, they imprinted on sandhills because whooping cranes will imprint on basically the first moving objects they see. So they imprinted on sandhill cranes and bred with sandhill cranes. So we actually hybridized those birds, and the experiment ended in 19. The whooping crane populations dramatically declined between the 1800s and 1940s. Historically, there may have been more than 10,000 individuals across North America. If you look to this figure on your right, you can see areas in yellow where their historic range, so it was relatively large with multiple wintering areas. Areas in purple, red, and green are what is the current extent of their range, which you can see is quite a bit smaller than what they used historically. Between 1941 and 1942, there were only 16 birds left in the Aransas wood buffalo population, and between 1944 and 1945, there are only 21 whooping cranes left in the wild. So what caused this dramatic decline? A major driver was habitat loss. If you look to this wetland figure on your left, you can see the percent wetland loss. It's very significant, but I really want to point towards the central United States where through the Central Flyway, which is where our population, the Aransas with buffalo population, migrates through. So Texas, Oklahoma, Kansas, North and South Dakota. And there was a really high percentage of wetland loss in these areas, which is an area that they use for at least a portion of their year. So about 50% of wetland loss has occurred, or should I say, Kansas has lost about 50% of its wetlands, and Oklahoma has lost about 76%. And of course, this had implications and led to a population decline. And this coincided with unregulated hunting and egg collection. It was kind of a perfect storm that led to that population crash. They were added to the endangered species list in 1973. They were actually one of the first species to be added and are still currently on that list. For our Louisiana population, their decline actually led to an extirpation or a regional extinction event for the species. In 1918, the last observation of wild migratory whooping cranes occurred in Louisiana when 12 were shot in a rice field. And then in 1939, the last documented successful breeding for whooping cranes occurred. And in 1940, a hurricane dispersed the flock, only 13 birds and 6 returned. And then in 1950, the last remaining wild bird, a lone female, was captured and transported to Aransas National Wildlife Refuge in Texas, where she sadly died 6 months later. The positive news is, as a result of this, ICF and other organizations began to reintroduce birds into this population in 2011. Since then, we've released annual cohorts of captive reared birds into the marsh. I believe the largest cohort was about 2 dozen. And they do this using costume rearing or captive rearing tactics. So this is a picture on your upper left of our captive rearing facility at ICF. They don the costume to make themselves look as much like a whooping crane as they can, and they feed using those hand puppets. So the only thing that those chicks see and hear are whooping crane noises, and they imprint on what looks like a whooping crane. And because we use this tactic, we're able to increase the amount of young raised per year versus that in the wild, because we can raise more than what pairs can raise. Then each year they release these captive reared birds into the Louisiana marsh. Before they are released, they're given a color band and transmitter so we can track, so the Louisiana Department of Wildlife and Fisheries can track their movements. And then we release them into a top netted pen so that they can acclimate. So during this time, they're still being supplemented with food items while learning to forage within the Louisiana marsh. And one really cool part of the Louisiana population is that they're still using the historic Louisiana habitats, even though they've now been transformed into rice or crawfish fields. They're still using those same areas of Louisiana. So over time, they've shifted to kind of share space with farmers and landowners, but they're still using their historic areas. And the Louisiana non-migratory population has grown quite a bit since reintroductions in 2011. We're now at about 83 birds. Right before summer ended, we actually got a text. We thought only that 4 chicks had fledged in the wild, but we got a text that said they found a 5th. So we're really excited about that because of course, we're excited about the 4, but to have 1 extra was so wonderful to hear. And our indicator of success for this population is that orange bar found across the top, which is the number of wild hatched chicks per year. So as that number grows, we will hopefully be able to release less captive birds, and we're on our way to a self-sustaining population for Louisiana. And at the Texas program, we focus on 3 objectives, the first being research and monitoring on whooping cranes and their habitats so we can better understand the species as a whole. We also work with landowners and partners so we can provide and protect land for whooping cranes. And then one of my favorite parts, of course, outreach and community engagement to raise awareness and appreciation for whooping cranes. And our population down in Texas has also been increasing in numbers. This is showing it between in the 1940s when they were at that low of 16 birds when they brushed extinction. And they steadily rose. Here's in 1987 when we reached 130 birds. And then from last year's surveys, we have an estimated 536 birds within the population. So of course, this is so wonderful, but the work is not left done. We will still have lots to do to ensure the safety for our population and the longevity of their lives. The whooping crane recovery team, which was a team of experts, determined that for us to downlist our population from endangered to threatened, we would need to protect sufficient habitat for 1,000 individuals, 250 of these breeding pairs. And then another recovery team in Texas determined that we would need 125,000 acres of coastal marsh and 300,000 acres of coastal prairies and fresh marsh to be able to support this many birds. And the current conservation concerns are not unlike those that the species faced in the 1940s, including collisions with power lines, fences, and cars. As they are migrating, or as they are moving with more short-term movements, such as flying down on the Texas coast to forage, collision with power lines is always an issue, as well as diseases such as highly pathogenic avian influenza. We have not had a case within our population of whooping cranes yet. It has occurred in other crane species, so we just want to be cognizant because it does require a rapid response. Overutilization from poaching and incidental take, as well as past and present destruction of habitat. As our population is growing, we will need more habitat to be able to support the amount of cranes that we have, as well as climate change can play a role as sea level rise may impact the distribution of our birds, adequacy of legal protections. If there is an instance of incidental take or poaching, we want to make sure that they're being prosecuted correctly. And for our Louisiana population, egg mortality plays a role, as some eggs are just not making it to hatching. They're not exactly sure why. We want to have more robust science so we can better understand why some of those wild hatch chicks are not making it to hatching. Back to some more of the life history of this species. For our Aransas wood buffalo population, they migrate biannually through a 2,500-mile migration route through the Central Flyway. It's a pretty narrow corridor. It's only about 182 miles wide, and most birds stay within 85-ish miles from the center line. If you look to this figure on your right, this shows data from our transmitter birds. A very small percentage of our population has transmitters, but they give us some really good data that we can look at to look at movements. So about 50% of our transmitter birds stay within this blue area of the Central Flyway. 75% stay within the tan and blue, and 95% of our birds are using the Central Flyway. They make 11 to 12 stopovers per migration. This is to roost, rest, and refuel. And they are diurnal migrants. So they do migrate during the day. And of course, this is a really exciting time because they're currently migrating back down to the coast. So I'm hoping that you guys are getting to see some while you're there. We just had 6 or 7 back down on the Texas coast. So it's been a very exciting time. And here's an animation showing exactly what that migration looks like from our transmitter bird data. These are subadults, so most of them are not paired. In the spring, they leave Aransas National Wildlife Refuge around March or April and head back up to Canada. This takes on average 29 days. And on arrival, they begin nesting. So as you can see, slowly but steadily, they start making their way up. It is not a perfect system. And most of them end up around Wood Buffalo National Park, but you can see D24 ends up very far west, and some don't make it all the way up to Canada either because they are subadults, so they are not nesting yet. So they don't really necessarily need to go all the way up to the Northern Territories. But in the fall, they begin making preparations around September and October. It looks a little bit different than spring migration because they spend about 2 to 4 weeks in Saskatchewan to stage. They have young. This is a really good teaching opportunity to teach them how to forage and get them prepared to migrate. So this is them stopping in Saskatchewan. And then from there, they pretty much just straight shot back down to the coast. So this takes on average 45 days, which is a bit longer than spring migration. And I mentioned stopover sites. So we have 5 critical stopover sites for our population, including that Saskatchewan staging area where they spend 2 to 4 weeks. The Central Platte River in Nebraska, Cheyenne Bottoms Wildlife Management Area, of course, Quivira National Wildlife Refuge, and Salt Plains National Wildlife Refuge in Oklahoma. Our team of researchers is in Oklahoma right now, flying surveys on the Cimarron and Red River to see how our cranes are using those rivers in Oklahoma. so we can maybe designate more critical habitat or just better understand their movements on migration. And they do, like many birds, show migratory behaviors such as pre-migratory restlessness, which it can be an increase in running, dancing, or flying. Of course, cranes are known for their dancing. It's what makes them so charismatic and so fun to watch. This restlessness is thought to be a response to day length, so that as there's an increase in photo periods or an increase in daylight, it stimulates that urge to migrate. They'll also take social cues from the rest of the flock that it's time to migrate, and will typically fly in groups or in pairs, and they'll take advantage of weather conditions such as a strong tailwind just to make their lives a little bit easier on migration. For their breeding behavior, they become sexually mature at 3 years old, but average age at first egg laying isn't typically until 5 years old. They are monogamous, so they mate for life. They strengthen these pair bonds through unison calling or dancing. As they are sexually monomorphic, it's really difficult to tell males and females apart just with the naked eye, but you can listen to their call and can typically tell males and females apart because when they do unison call, the male will typically call first and his call is deeper. So while you can't tell just by looking at them because they look very identical, you can sometimes tell by ear who's who in pairs. They will also establish core areas each winter to maintain pair bonds. So they will spend essentially the entirety of their lives together. They also breed at their summering grounds in and around Wood Buffalo National Park, laying up to 2 eggs per year. This is what is known as the insurance hypothesis, that if they lay 2 eggs, there's a greater chance of at least one surviving. When both survive, we call that twins. And we had 11 sets of twins last year make it down to the Texas coast. So that was very exciting to see. They're adorable. And it's just essentially points to enough resources to be able to raise 2 young. The chicks are also precocial and show rapid growth. So for the first 3 months of life, they're growing up to 1 inch per day, reaching that 5-foot height by 3 months, which is when they fledge and are able to fly. They'll also show site fidelity to breeding grounds, returning to about the same areas each year. Mm-hmm. The juveniles will show a color change when they come down to their wintering grounds. When the juveniles arrive, they're this beautiful cinnamon color. So sometimes they can be confused with sandhill cranes because they are not their typical snowy white plumage. It takes about 18 months for them to reach the full snowy white adult plumage. The photo on the right is right before they're about to head back to their summering grounds in Wood Buffalo, and they still have quite a bit of that cinnamon color around their face. But when they return the following winter, they'll be full snowy white, and it's really difficult to differentiate the juveniles and adults at that time. But it's really cool to see their cinnamon color. Their diet items change based on their geographic range, of course, and also availability. Whooping cranes molt about every 2 to 3 years, and they will try to coincide this, or it will naturally coincide typically with after their chick hatches in the summer, because this is a time where they're spending a lot of time within their territory foraging with their chick. So it's not a good time to be flightless, but they're already spending a lot of time on the ground. So they'll also, during this period, they may increase their protein and fats, as these are 2 items for feather formation and also extra energy expenditure. But in the summer, they will eat large nymphal or larval forms of insects. This is a key diet item for hatchlings, frogs, rodents, small birds, minnows, and berries. And then in winter, when they're down on the Texas coast, they'll eat blue crabs and clams, as well as harvest grains, acorns, and the Carolina berry. They are opportunistic omnivores, so they'll eat essentially anything, including snakes. We have seen them with water moccasins in their bill before. And I wanted to talk a little bit about some of the research we're doing on the coast. This past winter, the Texas team started 2 new research projects. We wanted to look at the inland use by our population, as well as their use of freshwater wetlands. This will be our 2nd year going into these studies, so we'll have a lot more data to look at where these birds are moving and what they're doing. Here's another animation showing some of their movements. In 2011, it was brought to our attention that some of our population was utilizing inland sites, and as they are typically thought as a salt marsh bird, it is really interesting to see them so far off the coast. Two of these areas include Granger Lake in Colorado and Wharton counties, which is west of Houston. And as you can see, a large portion of the transmitter birds are still utilizing those salt marsh habitats, but we have a few birds further inland, and we wanted to know why and what implications this had for conservation. And what we found from this study, one of our preliminary results, was that those birds that are utilizing inland sites have higher daily movements. So even if they're not moving between the coast and inland sites, they're still moving quite a bit more than salt marsh birds. And some of them are still coming down to the salt marsh. We're not exactly sure why, but they are making the trek down to the coast and then back to inland agricultural sites. So for this study, we looked at behavior of inland versus salt marsh birds. We wanted to see if any differences exist in how they're using their habitats or just their daily behaviors. So we looked at foraging, walking and flying, resting, alertness, loafing, preening, and any social interactions, both with the other species and among the population. We also wanted to record any diet items that were consumed and any instances of disturbance. And from the first year, we have 940 minutes of behavioral data from salt marsh and bays and 618 minutes from inland agricultural areas. We will be continuing this study this year, and we'll hopefully have even more data so we can compare those behaviors to see if any more differences exist other than that higher daily movement of the inland birds. And why was this research important? Most of what we know about the population during the winter comes from their core wintering range in the salt marshes. This figure on your right shows habitat suitability for our population. So areas in red are known to be good whooping crane habitat. So we would think that they would be moving further east, but instead, like this bird D24, they're using those inland agricultural sites. This continued use of these inland areas has implications for how we plan for this population. That other population found in Louisiana also uses agricultural sites. So we want to understand how this could have implications for both of the populations we work with as they have continued use of agricultural sites. Texas also produces about 225,000 acres of rice annually, and as many of our birds have been noted to use rice fields, we want to know how this is going to impact our partnerships with landowners, as well as an understanding of these habitats can help us inform management. Again, they are primarily known as a salt marsh species, but they will utilize nearby freshwater. So our second study was looking at their use of freshwater wetlands. Some birds may have a salt gland, so they can excrete excess salt. Whooping cranes do not have that, so at some point they do need fresh water. Here is an animation showing river flow in the Texas Gulf Coast hydrologic region. I think of this as kind of the beating heart of our bay. So as we have freshwater inflows, this is impacting our salinity and impacting diet of whooping cranes. And we have areas where there's very little freshwater inflow, then we have areas where there's quite a bit of freshwater inflow, as you can see. And it's just a really cool animation just showing what river inflow looks like. But to get a little bit more specific, once bay salinities reach about 15 to 23 parts per thousand, whooping cranes need dietary fresh water. And food resources in the salt marsh may also suffer under hypersaline conditions. Here's a really good example of a diet item whooping cranes utilize when they're on the Texas coast, the Carolina wolfberry. The top photo is during a wet year. There is quite a bit of fruit production. And the bottom photo is during a dry year. As you can see, there's a significant decrease in fruit production. And as this is an important diet item, this can have implications for how they're impacted in the winter during dry years. They're also found to spend more time in the prairie and in wetlands during drought years. This could point to a need for that dietary freshwater, and it can also point to a need to forage in different areas as their food resources are suffering under those areas. For this study, we did some wetland sampling. We looked at water quality, soil properties, dragonfly and damselfly larvae, as well as running some vegetation transects so we could better understand what characteristics whooping cranes were using and what essentially they were looking for in a wetland where they were spending most of their time. Our goal for this study was to collect data at 70 sites. We were able to go to 29 in the first year. This is the second year of the study, so we're now fully staffed this year, so we're hoping to go to even more sites We also did some game camera trapping. We wanted to validate movement data from transmitter birds, and we were able to deploy cameras at 11 wetlands and collected 76,000 game camera photos. As we think of whooping cranes as an umbrella species, so how we impact conservation for whooping cranes can have impacts for species that also utilize similar habitats. It has implications for conservation of a multitude of species. So right now we're working with a wonderful group of community scientists to process those game camera photos. We are almost done. These are some of our game camera highlights of some of the other species that we found. And why was this study important? These results have implications for management of federal and state lands for cranes. It highlights which wetlands are important and why. And it helps us inform land managers what type of wetland restoration we should focus on. So when we're working with our partners, we can highlight exactly what parts of the wetland cranes are using, including food resources and what those habitat characteristics look like. And probably the most fun research from this summer, I started about 6 months ago, so I knew I probably wouldn't get to see my first whooping crane until right now. But in April and May, some of our volunteers brought to our attention that there were still 3 cranes on the refuge, and they actually ended up spending the entirety of the summer. So we had 3 over-summering cranes. For the entirety of the summer, we looked for them every few weeks, and they did try to hide from us, understandably, but we were able to find them most of the time just to check on body condition and that they were still there. In July, we were able to get some behavior data from them. So our biologist and myself were on the refuge looking for them, and we noted some really interesting behaviors. We knew at least one crane had the ability to fly, but these 2 that in the photo on your left actually approached this pond. One showing the ability to fly and one not. One actually made the attempt to fly, got about 10 feet off the ground and dropped back down. And as a result, we put up these game cameras to see if we could get a better look, a closer look at body condition, and if they were still utilizing these freshwater ponds. This is actually a freshwater pond that we had installed for times during when we had drought conditions on the Texas coast. And we were able to get some really awesome photos of them to show body condition, including this photo on your right showing all cranes in flight, letting us know that for whatever reason that they had been flightless during the summer, they all now had the ability to fly. But it also pointed us to some really interesting information, including this bright band of white feathers. We had kind of made the assumption that at least 1 or 2 of them had probably molted while they were here. But you can see there's this kind of rufous coloring on their main body, but then you have this band of snowy white feathers. And it's also not a extremely straight line. They're kind of, for lack of a better word, scraggly. That's because they're new feather formation. So it let us know that all 3 cranes had molted new flight feathers. So we are very thankful for our game cameras. And I'll talk a little bit about some other objectives that we focus on the coast, including outreach and education. We want to increase awareness and appreciation for whooping cranes to reduce numbers of shootings, and also to participate in courtroom advocacy and work to make sure judges know the value of a whooping crane. Myself and our North America assistant actually attended a commission meeting in Cheyenne Bottoms last week. So I was actually able to see Quivira in Cheyenne Bottoms last week. I wish I could have attended this week as well, but unfortunately I could not. For a solar farm that is possibly going up near the Cheyenne Bottoms. So we were able to advocate for the cranes in that moment. We also use social science to inform our outreach work, and we work with a wonderful group of community science on our whooping crane research. And we do have some more outreach and education opportunities coming up, including some Girl Scout programming, library programs, as well as school programs. And if you were ever down on the Texas coast, this year we're starting our first annual Whooper Walk, starting in November and running till February. We will be taking people out to see whooping cranes on their wintering grounds. And of course, other festivals and events. And another really important part of what we do for protection of whooping cranes is landowner and partner engagement. We provide available freshwater and freshwater inflows to benefit cranes and the habitats on which they depend. This year, we started our first cost share program titled Wells and Waters for Whoopers. We had a partnership with the San Antonio Bay Partnership for about the last 10 years, we again used game cameras to validate that cranes were using freshwater solar wells that ourselves and other organizations had implemented. So we decided, based on the 10 years of documented wetland use from whooping cranes, we wanted to start our own cost share program. And we do this to promote land protection and sound habitat management. And while you guys are there, you are ever out birding, please remember to send in your banded bird ID photos. Here's what these look like on our cranes. They're obviously, if I was in person, I would show you how massive our bands are. They're huge, but we also have transmitter birds. So please, if you see a banded crane in the wild, take a photo if you can. Make sure you prioritize your safety and the crane's safety. We say a good rule of thumb is to stay at least 2 football field lengths away. You can still see them through a scope or through your binos, but you are prioritizing your safety. They are the tallest bird in North America, and they can get very territorial. So we just want to make sure you're being safe. So please report these to either eBird. We have our own portal on savingcranes.org, and also the Texas Wilbur Watch has a portal. As only a very small portion of our population has transmitters, and only about 10% of our population has bands, this is a really great way for us to study them over time, to see their movements. Because of course our transmitters die and we aren't always able to get our eyes on banded birds. So any of your contribution helps as community scientists. There are a few other ways you can help. You can join our flock and become a member. One of my favorite parts of being a member is that you receive the bugle. We were actually in the July article talking a little bit about some of the research I just talked with you guys about. You can volunteer. I have lots of virtual volunteers. So if you're ever interested in hearing more about our program, or doing some social science or research with us, please let me know. You can tell your friends and families about whooping cranes or like us on social media. We also have a From the Field webinar series that happens about once a month. We also have a From the Field webinar series library showing all of our past webinars that can be found on YouTube. It shows not only the work we're doing on the coast and with whooping cranes, but with all 15 crane species. It's just really great to hear what ICF is doing across the globe. Are foraging at night, so you'll be able to see them at dusk, typically coming into their roost. So they'll be coming into a river or back into a wetland from wherever they were out foraging from. They don't typically migrate at night. They like to migrate during the day, but you will be able to see them in early morning or early evening as they're moving from their roost to their foraging sites. And we have about 84 in Louisiana. The pair will return to about the same place they either bred the year before, if they're a new pair, and they're still trying to figure out exactly how the whole system works. It might take them a little bit longer, but the more mature pairs will pretty much lay immediately after they build their nest. And then younger pairs, it may take them a little bit longer to figure out not only nest building, but negative impacts is that it is within their central flyway. If there is power lines is one of the leading causes of mortality. There's also the lake effect. So they can maybe perceive the solar panels as water, and that can cause collision impacts. And as they are a very slow growth species, loss of one adult can disproportionately affect our species. So loss of just one crane can have effects on their genetic variability. So we don't even, of course, they are still endangered, increasing, but the loss of even one bird can have a high impact. It depends on who is making a special effort. We of course want them not out of the flyway. We do really respect renewable energies, and of course they create jobs. But what cranes do is it's not the risk of collision. They'll actually avoid areas that have wind power. So if they're near an important wetland, they may avoid that area. Just may cause excess strain during migration as they're having to kind of divert, just take away that energy that they're really needing to put into migration, because they're going to avoid those areas with wind power. So we just want to make sure that if they are going in, they're going in away from their critical habitat zones, so they can still make that trek. Actually, there have been quite a few prosecuted. We actually just had a court case out of Oklahoma that just came to a close, where we are pretty happy with the verdict that came through. I can send out that article, but all poachers were caught in that case. The Oklahoma game wardens did a really great job in that case. And they all were prosecuted under the Migratory Bird Species Act. And it was, we were pretty happy with that verdict. Lost their shotguns were taken for at least a year, I believe. They all had to pay about $15,000 on top of a fine. Our work is made possible by the support of people like you. So thank you so much for being here today and listening. Please consider checking out our website at savingcranes.org.